In December 2004, the quiet farming town of Skidmore, Missouri, became the center of one of the most disturbing crimes in modern American history. Bobbie Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old dog breeder and expectant mother, was just days away from welcoming her first child when she agreed to meet a woman interested in buying a puppy. She didn't know it would be the last decision she'd ever make. What happened next stunned the nation. Stinnett was killed in her own home, and her unborn daughter was taken from her. The baby vanished without a trace, triggering an urgent nationwide Amber Alert and a frantic search by the FBI. The suspect? Lisa Montgomery, a woman with a deeply troubled past, a web of lies about pregnancies, and a history marked by unimaginable trauma. But her crime was not a moment of impulse. Prosecutors would later argue it was carefully planned. Montgomery would become the first woman in nearly 70 years to be executed by the U.S. federal government. On the night of January 13, 2021, she ate her final meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken with French fries and a Diet Coke. And when asked for any last words, she simply said no. It would take 16 years, countless legal battles, and fierce debate over mental illness and justice before she faced the ultimate consequence of her actions. To understand how the lives of two women collided in a tragedy that shook America, and how a convicted killer met her fate in silence, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just haunt a community, it haunts a nation. Lisa Marie Montgomery's story begins far from the quiet streets of Skidmore, Missouri, in the rural towns of Kansas, where she was born in February 1968. From the very beginning, her life was marked by instability. Court records, later unsealed during her trial, painted a grim picture, a childhood overshadowed by severe abuse, neglect, and repeated trauma. Her family life was chaotic. There was little safety, little comfort, and almost no stability. Witness statements and psychological evaluations would later detail how she endured years of mistreatment from both parents and step-parents, a pattern that left deep emotional scars. By her teenage years, Lisa had already begun showing signs of mental health struggles that, according to experts, went untreated for most of her life. She was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and dissociative disorders. Perhaps most unusual was her experience with pseudocyesis, a rare condition in which a woman believes she is pregnant, displaying many physical signs of pregnancy despite not actually carrying a child. Friends and extended family members, in interviews years later, recalled that Lisa could be soft-spoken and polite, but also withdrawn, almost disconnected from reality at times. Beneath her quiet demeanor was a lifetime of trauma she never truly escaped. While Lisa's life was shaped by hardship and instability, Bobbie Jo Stinnett's path could not have been more different. Born in December 1981, Bobbie Jo was a lifelong resident of Skidmore, Missouri, a close-knit farming community where neighbors waved from their porches and doors were often left unlocked. From a young age, Bobbie Jo had a deep love for animals, especially dogs, a passion she shared with her high school sweetheart and later husband, Zeb Stinnett. Together, they started a small dog breeding business, specializing in rat terriers. They advertised puppies online, shipping them to new homes all over the country. Friends and neighbors remembered Bobbie Jo as someone who always had a smile on her face, someone who could make anyone feel welcome. She was known for her kindness, her energy, and her dedication to her work. By late 2004, she was not only helping run the family business, but was also preparing for one of the happiest moments of her life, the birth of her first child, a baby girl she and Zeb planned to name Victoria Jo. Photos from that time show Bobbie Jo in her modest home, holding a puppy in one hand and resting the other on her growing belly, her eyes full of excitement for the future. In Skidmore, Bobbie Jo's pregnancy was a point of joy for the whole community. Friends threw her a baby shower, neighbors dropped off gifts, and even her online puppy customers knew about the big event she was counting down to. She was just 23 years old, but she had a clear vision for her future, raising her daughter, continuing her business, and building a life surrounded by the people and animals she loved most. Two women, two very different lives. One marked by pain and trauma, the other by warmth and stability. And yet, in December 2004, the paths of Lisa Montgomery and Bobbie Jo Stinnett would cross, with consequences that would change both their stories forever. By mid-December 2004, winter had settled over Skidmore. The streets were quiet, holiday decorations hung from porches, and for Bobbie Jo Stinnett, life was filled with the excitement of preparing for her baby's arrival. On the morning of December 16th, she had no reason to believe anything was out of the ordinary. That same day, Lisa Montgomery, living over 170 miles away in Melbourne, Kansas, was making plans of her own, plans that would take her deep into the heart of Missouri. Evidence uncovered later in court would reveal that Lisa had been corresponding with Bobbie Jo online, posing as Darlene Fisher, a woman interested in buying one of Bobbie Jo's rat terrier puppies. The two women had exchanged friendly messages through an online dog breeding forum, arranging for Lisa to come to Bobbie Jo's home to see the puppies in person. But prosecutors would later allege that Lisa's intentions had nothing to do with the dog. Internet search history and trial evidence showed that in the days leading up to the meeting, Lisa had researched how to perform a cesarean section and how to care for a newborn. Chilling clues pointing to a carefully thought-out plan. That afternoon, Lisa made the drive from Kansas into Skidmore. The journey would have taken her across open farmland and quiet rural roads, a stark contrast to the dark intent that prosecutors say was on her mind. At around 2:30 p.m., she arrived at the modest white house where Bobbie Jo lived with her husband, Zeb. What happened next would never be fully known outside of what investigators could piece together from the scene and Lisa's later accounts. Inside the home, at some point during the visit, the meeting turned violent. In the moments that followed, Bobbie Jo was killed. According to the federal indictment and court testimony, Lisa then removed the unborn baby from Bobbie Jo and took the infant with her, leaving the young mother lifeless on the floor. By the time Lisa walked out of that house, she was carrying the newborn girl, later named Victoria Jo, as if she were her own. Just after 3 p.m., Zeb Stinnett returned home, expecting to find his wife going about her day, perhaps preparing dinner or caring for the dogs. He instead stepped into a nightmare. He found Bobbie Jo and immediately called 911, his voice filled with shock and panic. Emergency dispatchers sent police and paramedics racing to the scene, but it was already too late to save Bobbie Jo. The baby, however, was nowhere to be found. Word of the crime spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors, friends, and family gathered in shock, and within hours, law enforcement had mobilized on a scale Skidmore had never seen. The Missouri State Highway Patrol, local sheriff's deputies, and the FBI launched an urgent search for the missing newborn, knowing that every hour was critical to her survival. Amber Alerts went out nationwide, describing the infant and appealing to the public for any information. In a matter of hours, the tragedy of Bobbie Jo's death had become a race against time, a desperate hunt to bring her daughter home alive. In the hours after Bobbie Jo Stinnett's death, Skidmore, Missouri, transformed from a quiet farming town into the center of a high-stakes, nationwide manhunt. Local police knew they were dealing with more than just a homicide. They were racing to save a newborn baby who had vanished without a trace. By that evening, the FBI had joined the investigation, working alongside the Missouri State Highway Patrol and the Nottoway County Sheriff's Department. Their first move was to issue a nationwide Amber Alert, flooding television screens, radio stations, and highway signs across multiple states with a description of the missing infant, a premature baby girl, just hours old, possibly in the company of a woman claiming to be her mother. The investigation began with the small details that could break the case wide open. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, gathering witness statements from anyone who might have seen a strange car or unfamiliar person in town that day. They traced Bobbie Jo's recent communications, focusing on her online activity through dog breeding message boards and email correspondence. It didn't take long for them to discover a series of exchanges with someone calling herself Darlene Fisher, the same name used to set up the meeting on December 16th. Digital forensics teams worked quickly to trace those messages back to an IP address in Kansas. And when investigators began looking into the woman behind the account, Lisa Montgomery's name surfaced. As they dug deeper, an unsettling pattern emerged. Friends, acquaintances, and even family members reported that Lisa had a history of claiming she was pregnant, sometimes showing signs that convinced those around her, yet never producing a child. These claims had raised eyebrows before, but now, in light of the missing newborn, they became a critical lead. By the next morning, December 17, 2004, the net was closing in. Acting on the digital trail and witness interviews, federal agents and Kansas law enforcement arrived in Melbourne, Kansas, a small town about 2 hours southwest of Kansas City, where Lisa lived with her husband. When they knocked on the door, Lisa answered while holding a tiny newborn wrapped in a blanket. The baby was alive, and to the untrained eye, appeared to be Lisa's own. But the investigators knew better. Inside the home, agents gently but urgently confirmed the baby's identity. Through quick medical checks and distinctive physical markers, they were able to determine that the infant was indeed Bobbie Jo Stinnett, taken less than 24 hours earlier from her mother's womb. Against all odds, she was unharmed. In that moment, the Amber Alert was canceled, and word spread that the baby was safe. Later that same day, Bobbie Jo was reunited with her father, Zeb, in a scene that was both heartbreaking and bittersweet. A young man holding his daughter for the first time while grieving the loss of his wife. Lisa Montgomery was taken into custody without incident and transported for federal processing. Within hours, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced that she was being charged with kidnapping resulting in death, a federal capital offense. The case, which had begun as a frantic manhunt, was now shifting into one of the most high-profile criminal prosecutions in recent memory, setting the stage for a courtroom battle that would focus not only on the horrific details of the crime, but on the question of Lisa's mental state and the role her traumatic past might have played in what happened in Skidmore. Act 4. Trial and Appeals. It would take more than 2 years for the case of United States versus Lisa Montgomery to reach a federal courtroom. But when it did, in October 2007, the eyes of a nation were on Kansas City, Missouri. The trial was held in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Missouri, and from the moment jury selection began, it was clear that both sides were preparing for a battle over not just the facts of what happened in Skidmore, but over the mind and motives of the woman sitting at the defense table. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of premeditation. They argued that this was not a crime of passion or a sudden act of desperation, but a carefully orchestrated plan. Federal prosecutors walked the jury step by step through Lisa's internet search history, showing that she had looked up how to perform a cesarean section, how to care for a newborn, and how to avoid detection. They presented evidence of her online communication with Bobbie Jo under the false name Darlene Fisher, and they detailed her travel from Kansas to Missouri on December 16, 2004, all while concealing her true intentions. Photographs, chat logs, and witness testimony painted a portrait of deliberate deception and a calculated effort to take another woman's child. The defense, led by attorneys specializing in capital cases, did not dispute that Lisa Montgomery had killed Bobbie Jo Stinnett and taken her baby. Instead, they asked the jury to understand the mental state in which she acted. They called psychologists and psychiatrists who testified that Lisa suffered from severe mental illnesses, including post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and dissociative disorders, all stemming from a lifetime of sexual abuse and emotional trauma. One of the most unusual elements was the claim that Lisa was experiencing pseudocyesis, a psychological condition in which a woman believes she is pregnant and even displays physical symptoms of pregnancy. According to the defense, this condition, combined with years of untreated trauma, led Lisa into a state of dissociation during the crime, leaving her incapable of fully understanding or controlling her actions. For nearly a month, jurors listened to testimony, reviewed graphic evidence, and heard emotional accounts from both sides. The prosecution emphasized the meticulous steps Lisa had taken to plan the crime, while the defense urged the jury to show mercy to a woman they described as deeply damaged and mentally ill. When deliberations concluded, The verdict was unanimous: guilty of kidnapping resulting in death. In the penalty phase, the jury again voted unanimously to recommend the death penalty, citing the calculated nature of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. The judge formally sentenced Lisa Montgomery to death, making her the first woman to receive a federal death sentence in more than half a century. What followed was more than a decade of legal wrangling. Lisa's defense team launched a series of appeals, arguing that she was incompetent to be executed under the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to her extensive psychiatric history, her brain damage from head injuries, and her ongoing delusions as evidence that she could not rationally comprehend her execution. Over the years, multiple courts granted temporary stays, halting her execution while appeals were reviewed. But those stays were often overturned by higher courts, keeping the case in a state of constant legal tension. Her lawyers took her case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, filing last-minute petitions and emergency motions in January 2021. On the night of January 12, 2021, just hours before the scheduled execution, a federal judge briefly halted the process to consider new evidence of Lisa's mental decline. But in the early hours of January 13th, the Supreme Court, in a divided ruling, lifted the final stay, clearing the way for the U.S. Department of Justice to carry out the sentence. After nearly 16 years of trials, appeals, and public debate, the legal chapter was over. The federal government would proceed with the execution of Lisa Montgomery, an act that would mark the end of one of the most controversial and emotionally charged cases in recent American history. Act 5. The Final Days and Execution. In the final weeks of her life, Lisa Montgomery was housed on federal death row at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, a place reserved for the most high-profile federal inmates awaiting execution. Her cell was small and austere, and her world had shrunk to a strict routine of monitored meals, brief recreational breaks, and visits with her legal team. Outside the prison walls, the case continued to draw intense public attention. Supporters argued that executing a woman with such a history of mental illness was a moral failure of the justice system, while others insisted that the brutality of her crime demanded the ultimate penalty. As her execution date drew closer, Montgomery's attorneys filed a flurry of last-minute motions in an effort to halt the process, citing her deteriorating mental state and a long history of psychiatric disorders. For a brief moment on January 12, 2021, it appeared those efforts might succeed. A federal judge issued a temporary stay to consider new evidence, but that reprieve lasted only a few hours. Shortly before midnight, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the stay, clearing the way for the federal government to move forward. In her final hours, according to prison records and media witnesses, Montgomery was allowed a last meal of her choosing. She requested a dinner of Kentucky Fried Chicken, crispy fried chicken pieces, with a side of French fries and a Diet Coke. She ate quietly, under the watchful eyes of prison staff, before being returned to her cell. There was no family present for her execution, though members of Bobbie Jo Stinnett's family had traveled to Terre Haute to witness it. In the early morning hours of January 13, 2021, guards came to escort Montgomery to the death chamber. Witnesses described her as calm, her eyes scanning the room but revealing little emotion. Once secured to the gurney, the warden asked the standard question: did she have any final words? Montgomery's answer was a single word: no. At 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time, the lethal injection was administered. Within moments, her breathing slowed, and a short time later, she was pronounced dead. Lisa Montgomery became the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government in nearly 70 years, her death closing the final chapter of a case that had haunted Skidmore, Missouri, and gripped the nation for more than a decade and a half. For Bobbie Jo Stinnett's family, it marked the end of a long and painful legal journey, though the loss of a wife, daughter, and mother-to-be would never truly heal. Narrator, voiceover. This case is more than just a chapter in criminal history. It's a story about life, loss, justice, and the questions we still struggle to answer about crime and punishment in America. What do you think? Was justice served? Or should mercy have played a greater role? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you or made you think, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and comment below with your perspective. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the real stories that shape our world.